All right, today we're going to dive into a pretty provocative piece from the Appalachian Guerrilla called Orrin McIntyre Doesn't Understand. Now, on the surface, this article looks like it's all about the culture war, but that's really just a smokescreen. The real argument is something much deeper and, honestly, pretty surprising. So let's pull back that curtain. So the article just throws you right in the deep end with this quote. I mean, it's a really jarring way to start. On one hand, you've got this extreme statement about immigration, but then in the very next breath, the author just dismisses these huge political issues. That contradiction, that's there on purpose. It's a hook, and it's designed to make you ask, wait, what is this actually about?
And yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The author is basically using that shock value to wave away all the usual talking points to get to what they believe is the real heart of the matter. So, what is it?
And bam, here's the pivot. The author says their actual concerns, the things that really keep them up at night, have nothing to do with those culture war battles. Instead, it's these three things: the insane cost of just having a roof over your head, the feeling that your hard work is worth less and less, and the sense that our communities are just falling apart. So this is it, the core thesis of the whole article. The author is making the case that we're all pointing fingers at the wrong culprit. The problem, in their view, isn't immigrants or cultural differences. It's the economic system itself, what they specifically call liberal capitalism, that actually creates the incentive for mass migration to happen in the first place. Let's see how they try to prove that. To build this argument, the author does something interesting. They don't look at last week's news or last month's headlines. Nope, they want to take us all the way back to the 1800s to argue that this tension between profit and people, well, it's nothing new. The blueprint for what's happening today, they claim, was drawn up a long, long time ago. And they use the story of the railroad baron Leland Stanford as their Exhibit A. This guy runs for governor on a platform of cracking down on immigration. He wins. But then what happens? His business hat goes on. He needs cheap labor for his railroads. So he turns right around and lobbies for tens of thousands more immigrants to come in, specifically to drive down wages. For the author, this is the perfect example of profits winning out over political promises every single time. Now, to really get where the author is coming from, you have to understand their specific view of capitalism. For them, it's a system that does one thing really well. It turns everything into a commodity. Land, our work, even money itself, it all becomes just another product to be bought as cheaply as possible and sold for the highest price. This framework is the lens for their entire argument. Okay, so with that history lesson in our back pocket, the author brings us back to today to identify who they think the true enemy really is. And, it might not be who you think. This slide really lays out the author's whole point. The public debate, the one you see on TV, is all stuck on immigration and culture. But the author says, no, you're missing the point. The real driver here is an economic engine that is always looking for cheaper labor to replace more expensive workers. That, to them, is the real story.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the author turns their focus onto the political right. They argue that conservatives can never actually fix this, because their primary loyalty isn't to the culture or the nation, but to that same profit-driven system. They call them capitalist liberals, who, in the author's own words, would sell their mother to make a nickel.
And that brings us to maybe the most provocative question in the whole piece. The author basically asks, what if declining birth rates aren't really a cultural issue, but a labor supply issue? They frame it like this: if a country isn't producing enough of its own people to, quote, feed into the blender of the economy, then the system will just look elsewhere to find the bodies it needs. And to back this idea up, the author points to this quote, which they attribute to the conservative commentator Bill Kristol. For them, this is like a smoking gun. It's an open admission of their whole thesis, that the push for new Americans isn't about ideals or culture, it's about fighting a workforce that's cheaper and more willing to work. So after all that criticism, where does this leave us? What's the solution? Well, the article doesn't end with a neat 10-point plan for Congress. Instead, the author pitches something much more fundamental, a solution built from the ground up to fight back against these pressures. So here's the path forward they propose. Step 1, you have to recognize that the real opponent isn't a group of people, it's the economic incentives. Step 2, start rebuilding the strong, tight-knit communities that have been worn down. And step 3, from those communities, develop leaders who can actually stand up to and push back against the economic powers that be. And in a really fascinating twist, the author says the key is to actually learn from the very immigrant groups that are so often at the center of the debate. They argue that these communities often succeed precisely because they have strong cohesion and unity, the exact things the author feels are missing from the broader culture. And so, that's the final challenge the article leaves us wrestling with. It lays out a diagnosis. The problem is a system that gets richer by pitting people against each other. And it offers a cure, community cohesion. But the massive lingering question is, how on earth do you build unity inside a machine that is literally designed to tear it apart?